When I was a grade schooler, our church had a after-school program for kids one day we called Joy Club. And maybe some of you are old enough to remember Joy Clubs. But I participated in Joy Club, and we did verse memorization. One of the early verses that I remember memorizing was Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that is not from yourselves, it's gift from God. It is not a result of works, so that no one may boast. We use this verse primarily as a verse for evangelism, telling unsaved people that you cannot work for your salvation. Because I grew up in a semi-religious or fairly religious community, but most of the people would attend church someplace and thought that they were saved in some way by their baptism and by their good works in addition to their faith. We pointed at this verse a lot. And this is what we talked about, was how a person comes to salvation by God's grace, but through faith on our part. And today we're going to take a look at this, and I'm going to demonstrate that at least in part, this is actually a great eternal security verse. And it really has more to do with you and I as believers than with the unsaved person in themselves. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and yes, we're looking at the doctrine of eternal security, meaning that if you believe the gospel, if you believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins and he rose again, and that you are forgiven through him, you're saved. Technically, Scripture almost all the time says we believe in Jesus Christ. One time it says we believe the gospel. But we're believing in Jesus Christ. The gospel simply defines what about Jesus Christ we believe. And if we believed in Jesus Christ, then we're saved, and eternal security then would state, and eternal security is not a word you're going to find in the Bible. It's a word like a lot of terms that we use in churches, a word to describe a activity or a condition or a state. And in this case, describing the fact that once you've believed, you are saved for all time. That's God's work. In fact, really one of the key things we're looking at the present time are looking at aspects of the character of God as it connects to our salvation, because salvation ultimately is God's work. I don't save myself. I didn't save myself. You didn't save yourself. You don't save yourself. God does that. So, what does Ephesians 2:8-9 have to do with it? Well, I suspect probably most people could come to this text and they go, well, you're saved by grace. So, if you were saved by grace, how could you unearn it? Absolutely. Completely agree. And you were saved through faith on your part. Again, we come to that and we look at this and we say, yeah, you believed the gospel. You believed in Jesus Christ. But that's where some people then get stuck and they go, well, what if for some reason you stop believing? And I've run into people I think are real believers, but because of some horrible turmoil in their life, they've really lost they're really lost in a struggle with what they think about God right now at this time. And they're like, I'm just not so sure. And when you go over the gospel, you can tell the gospel means something to them. But they just don't know that they believe this. And maybe some of them aren't saved, but I think some of them are. It's just that the struggle they've gone through has become so difficult that it's hard for them to continue looking forward to what God has. And so there are people that are going to say, well, there are people that stop believing. They don't believe in Jesus anymore and such like that. So they've lost their salvation. But this is where, and I have to say this, when I went to seminary, and please do not misunderstand what I'm about to say, but one of the big things we spent a lot of time doing where I went to school is, we worked every day in class, not just in Greek class, but in other classes. You learned or used biblical Greek in addition to biblical Hebrew. And I really have, for the last 35 plus years since seminary, I have really used the biblical Greek that I've learned. I've used it a lot. I would say almost every day. Even if I'm just pulling up my Bible and reading, I'm probably reading from a Greek testament. Does that make me better than somebody who doesn't know Greek? No. Doesn't mean I understand the Bible way better than people that don't know Greek. Not necessarily. But there are things sometimes that our English Bibles maybe don't always bring across to us. And I'm convinced, I think that verse 8 is one of those. Because when we read verse 8, this is the way the average American reader, English reader, is going to read this verse. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Now, if you actually see that you have been saved through faith, we ought to be able to understand that in what we would call the perfect sense that even we have in English, perfect passive. But in Greek, this is so important for us. In Greek, this perfect tense is looking something that happened in the past, but has a continuing result into the present. In other words, for by grace, you are, literally, this is written in a way that is saying, you are ones having been saved by grace through faith with, and then we would have to expand the translation with the result that you are still in that state of being saved by grace. And all of this then through faith. So in other words, the perfect tense lays emphasis on something that happened back there that continues on, at least to the present when the author is writing this, that this is what we can be said. This really is a verse being written to Christians about their condition. This really isn't a verse for unsaved people, because it's not saying unsaved. If it's for unsaved people, it would be saying, hey, you unsaved people, you are ones that have been saved by grace through faith, but they haven't been saved because they haven't believed. They could be if they would believe, but they haven't yet. This is really a verse written to the believers in the city of Ephesus to tell them, you are ones that are in this condition, this state of having been saved by God's grace and through faith. And this wasn't from yourselves. And you would say, you have to tell believers that? Yeah, sometimes you have to remind believers, hey, were you saved by works? And they were going, well, no. But sometimes we forget and we kind of think, well, I'm better than them and I'm better than him. And were you saved by your works? Well, no. Well, then why are you so focused on how much better you think you are than everybody else? And that's part of the problem in the city of Ephesus with these believers among themselves. It's God's gift. It's not a result of works, so no one can boast. I can't sit there and go, well, I'm a Gentile, and you Jews, or the Jews go, well, we're Jews. We've been God's people. You are Gentile. That's part of the issue in this letter. But that's not going on. So this is a strong eternal security verse. When you have something anchored in the past, this salvation in the past, and it continues to the present. And if it weren't enough that God says it here, a lot of Christians, I think, would be surprised that if you read through the whole book of Ephesians, just a couple of sentences before, in verse 5, he says, even when we were dead in our, and this should be the word trespasses, not transgressions, dead in or by means of our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. Now here he doesn't even say the by faith part. He's just saying, you are ones saved by grace through faith. And it's the same exact construction that we have in verse 8. We're saved by grace. Now, in the culture of the New Testament, grace could be that, well, I gave you a gift. Why did you give me that gift? Because you came and helped clean up my yard last week, and I wanted to bake this pie for you. Something like that. So a grace in their culture could be a kindness that you did because somebody else did a kindness for you. But God takes that word grace and he has Jesus Christ begins to do this in the way he lives his life, according to the Gospel of John. But it's actually going to be Paul who, on the vocabulary level, is going to take this word and they're going to tweak the definition so that we get to Romans 11:6, just as one quick passage. For if it is by grace, and he's talking about election. This is not about exactly what Paul's talking about in Ephesians 2. But what he's doing is he's talking about the nature of grace. If it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. Meaning, If something is by grace, from God's point of view, taking this word, it's not because you did a kindness for me and so I've done a kindness back to you. No, grace is now not on the basis of works. If it is on the basis of works in any way, it ceases to be grace, according to this text. It's not grace. So when we're talking over here in Ephesians chapter 2, and we're talking in verse 8 about being saved, keep in mind when you read this, even though maybe you take an unsaved person to this verse, it's really not about them. It's really about you and I. And it's a verse that you and I, it's a verse that you and I should really understand and appreciate. Why? Because it tells us I'm in this state because of God's grace. And yes, I directed faith at the promise back then, but now I remain in this condition or state by the grace from God. And that, without using the word eternal security, because the Bible doesn't use it, that is eternal security. God's grace saved me, and I am in that state still of one being saved because of what God has done. Think on that. Appreciate that. Thank Him for that today, wherever you might be. And as always, thank you for joining me.